Good morning. This is Mars.
Wrist mode under
Our tank kilometers
parachute
accelerated and descending. We are at 150 meters per second.
This is actually
Dynamics
a
phase.
video of the
Come
surface
back
of
again
Mars
with,
that some
wrist
friends
mode
of mine and I made.
Wrist mode is nominal.
It was actually a really hard video to make. Truth be told, we didn't make the camera, we just held it. This video is made by a camera called the MARTI Imager, made by Malin Space Systems in San Diego, California, and it's strapped to the world's largest extraterrestrial rover. And as this video is shot, that rover is hanging underneath the world's largest supersonic parachute, 2.5 miles above the surface of Mars. Now I want to share with you that story, the story of making this video, some lessons that I learned from my team, that we learned together about overcoming challenges, about keeping people motivated. This effort took 10 years. How do you keep a team motivated and focused for 10 years? We faced a lot of challenges and we had a lot of setbacks. How do we overcome some of those? So I want to share with you some stories and some insights that I think I garnered from that experience. But perhaps most importantly, I want to leave you with the understanding that our curiosity, our human curiosity, is perhaps one of the greatest tools that we have to overcome challenges that are put in front of us. Now, curiosity is a personal thing, right? We're all sitting here and all of our curiosities have slightly different flavors. So the story of Mars doesn't start for me at Mars, it starts here. This is the San Francisco Bay Area. Actually, this image is taken not far from the house that I grew up in. And it's apropos because although it's slightly difficult to see, in the upper left-hand side of this image, you can see some stars. That's actually the constellation of Orion. And that has meaning because I was a 20-year-old, listless, wannabe rock star, a bass player gigging in the San Francisco Bay Area, waiting to become famous and rich. That would have been a really long wait. And one night, as I returned home from playing a show, I looked up at the night sky and I noticed that the stars were in a different place than they had been when I went out to load into the show. Now, I had been a very poor student in high school. Evidently, I'd missed that whole Earth spinning on its axis thing. So I thought that the stars were moving. And it was that constellation of Orion, in fact. I didn't know it was Orion at the time, but I'd gone out to play. It had been over the East Bay. I came home, and it was over the Marin Headlands. And I got curious. And I decided to follow my curiosity. I decided to explore a little bit. I went down to the local community college to take an astronomy course to tell me why the stars were moving. It had a prerequisite of a conceptual physics course. And I'm like, physics? I don't think so. But then the subtitle of the course said, physics without math. I'm like, maybe that would work. Joke was on me. The astronomy course got canceled because it didn't have enough people, and there I am in the physics course. But it actually changed my life. That spark of curiosity, wondering about the night sky, following that curiosity led me to, after a little bit of work, maybe a lot of work, a bachelor's and master's and a PhD, landing rovers on Mars. If old Adam had been told what Adam of today's job is, my head would have exploded. But thank God we don't really know where our curiosity is going to take us. So now let's talk about Mars. For eons, Mars has captivated our attention. From before we could have aids to our vision, we'd look up in the night sky and we'd see a light a little redder, a little brighter, and moved differently than the other lights in the celestial sphere. When we got our first telescopes, we looked out and we saw life. We saw roadways and canals. We saw civilization. And then we got better telescopes. And we realized that those are actually just natural features. But we never lost that idea that maybe Mars was alive. And that's understandable. It's a profound question, right? Are we alone? Are we alone in our universe? Are we alone in our solar system? Could our nearest neighbor harbor life? NASA's gone to Mars a few times to try and answer that question of life. Here's a family portrait of the rovers we put on the surface of Mars. Starting in '97 with a little Sojourner rover. Very important because we were able to explore at much reduced cost than we'd been in the past. We actually vowed to go back again and again and again. Every 26 months, we had some failures. There's more than 26 months between '97 and '04. But in '04, we put down twin rovers, Spirit and Opportunity, on the opposite sides of the planet. And they were kind of important. They taught us that Mars had once had liquid water on its surface. And we know from here on Earth, where there's liquid water, there's life. No liquid water, no life. But they couldn't tell us some important things about the water. Was it salty or sweet? Was it acidic or basic? In short, was that ancient wet environment habitable? Well, in comes Curiosity. She's 900 kilograms. Chock full of all the science instruments we would need to answer that question of life. But she's hard to land. Really hard to land. Now, if you want to get to the surface of Mars, and you're going to take anything bigger than a bread box or smaller than a house, you have to do these 4 things. To orders of magnitude, powers of 10, you hit the atmosphere going about 10,000 miles an hour. On landing night for Curiosity, we hit the atmosphere going 13,327 miles an hour. That's fast. In fact, that's fast enough that the energy of motion, the kinetic energy, can melt or vaporize the entire spacecraft. Now that is considered poor form. So we wrap the spacecraft in a special shell. We call it an aeroshell. We coat it with a material that will smolder and it won't burn. And we shed that energy to the atmosphere of Mars. We kind of burn a hole in the sky of Mars. And that process slows us down to about 1,000 miles an hour. Still not slow enough to land on the surface of Mars, so we opened up a parachute, the world's largest supersonic parachute. Opened up just shy of twice the speed of sound, gives us a neck-snapping 12 Gs of deceleration. If the parachute were unfurled here, it would be a little bit wider than this room is long. That slows us down more to powers of 10, 100 miles an hour, in actuality about 180 miles an hour for us. Still not slow enough to land on the surface of Mars, so we have to let go of that parachute and go to rockets. Now, every expedition to the surface of Mars has used these approaches. But then, depending on the particulars, how good your rockets are, do they have throttles? Do you have a good sensor that looks at the ground? Can you tell your speed relative to the ground? You need some last landing or touchdown system to take out that last little bit of energy. For us, even though we landed at 1.5 miles an hour, that's about like a brisk Manhattan walk, a gentle kiss with the Martian surface, the engineering of that touchdown system gave us some of the greatest challenges. And we weren't going just any place, we were going here. This is the Gale Crater. It sits in the middle of Mars on the equator. It's massive. 90 miles across, you can see the crater rim in the edge of these images. And in the center of the crater, the mammoth Mount Sharp, 15,000 feet above the crater floor, higher than anything in the continental US, anything in the Rockies, anything in the Sierras. And NASA wanted us to put this rover right there, between the proverbial rock and a hard place. You know, this is a digital elevation map. It's made from orbiter overflight data, stereo images that are taken from successive orbital passes and then reconstructed to an elevation-correct digital rendering of the surface. It's rendered for a perspective of about 40,000 feet, like you're flying in a high-altitude jet. Images like this used to keep me up at night. They would wake me up, actually, for some weird reason, at 2:30 in the morning every night. I'd wake up all anxious about how we were going to get our rover down there in the safe flats. And I would go through my list of concerns, which really amounts to like a list of ways to die on the surface of Mars. And I'd walk down them, and slowly I would fall back to sleep. Some people count sheep. I was counting ways to die on the way to Mars. Not quite as fun. Here's another way of understanding that challenge. This is a shaded relief. Orange is high, blue is low. You can see the crater rim and Mount Sharp coming out of the center, and I've overlain all of the miss distances, the 99 percentile ellipses for all of the expeditions to the surface of Mars. And you can see as time has gone on, we've got better at understanding where Mars is, what its atmosphere is like, sort of ranging those ellipses down. But to make it onto the flat, safe blue spot, we were going to have to get a whole quantum better with Curiosity. And when we got to the surface, we weren't just landing any old rover. We were landing a rover big compared to other rovers, a rover big compared to human artifacts, right? This is beside a Mini. If the rover was sitting down here on the floor, I couldn't reach the top of her mast with the top of my hand here. She was big. And that touchdown system really challenged us. In fact, we suffered a lot of setbacks associated with that touchdown system. We started with an airbag approach to take up that final impact. That's what we'd use to put the twins, Spirit and Opportunity, and the little tiny Sojourner rover on the surface of Mars years earlier. Now, unfortunately, at 900 kilos, there are no fibers known to humankind. No polyaramids, no PBOs, no spectra, Vectran, Kevlar, you name it, there's nothing, we don't have it, that we can make a fabric out of that's strong enough to make bags that could survive the landing. We tried that for a few years, we had to abandon it. We thought about using a legged lander approach. You know, Viking had landed in the 70s with a legged lander. Apollo used legged landers. Well, between Pathfinder and the twins, there was a failure. And that failure was a legged lander. And as we went back through the failure analysis, which is perhaps the most uncomfortable experience, but the most productive as far as learning, when you look at your failures, we refamiliarized ourselves with exactly how tippy and unstable a legged lander is in rough, uneven, and uncertain terrain. You put a 900-kilo rover on the top of it, tippier still. So that was out. For a while, we looked at trying to solve the stability problem by adding legs, splaying them out flat, and letting the lander belly flop. Now, the propulsion tanks are in the belly of the beast, and our fuel is annoyingly toxic and explosive. Exploding on touchdown, also considered super poor form. And so we armored the belly of the beast to protect ourselves against that impact, and by the time we got done with that, she was basically too heavy to launch. So eventually we gathered all the principal folks who had ever had anything to do with landing something on the surface of Mars. That ranged from wizened, gray-haired generals of the first Mars expeditions all the way down to wet behind the ears young whippersnappers. And we got in a room, not very well air-conditioned room 201 of building 158 at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and we spent 2 sweaty days in that room trying to brainstorm a new way of getting to the surface of Mars. We had this big, huge rover. We knew we needed to put this big rover on the Mars. We didn't know how we would do that final touchdown system. When we came out of that day, the first day, we had this. We called it direct placement, but people immediately called it the sky crane. And I learned some very important lessons during those 2 days. Perhaps the most important of which, the first and the primary, was how we went about the process of that brainstorming and that investigation. I awoken during those 2 days to a feature of the culture of JPL that had been there for years that I just recognized. It's a culture that takes ideas and the people who bring them into play, and it separates them. The essence of the cultural attribute is the separation of ideas from the people who hold them. And why would you do that? You do that so that you personalize the idea. You don't have your personal investment in an idea that you bring into play, so that the ideas can engage in brutal, actually mortal combat with one another. Unaltered, unprotected by their sponsor, these ideas do battle. That happened in that room. The other attribute of separating ideas from the people who hold them is you want to love the people. You want to respect the people. You want to care for the people. And you want to be able to beat the bejesus out of the ideas. And so you don't want people to feel that they're being beaten on because you're beating on their idea. And to do that, you have to have the ideas and the people separated. It's a powerful, powerful tool, and I'll talk a little bit about that more later. So we emerged from the room with this sky crane, and it looked a little nutty. We felt it looked a little nutty. We knew two things when we left the room. One, sound engineering principles had driven us to that solution. And two, every time we spoke of it, we lost credibility. We'd go, yeah, sky crane, and people are like, whoa, 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 whoa. What is up with that? You are nuts. I'm not even listening. In fact, it was my job to do a lot of the talking. And so I developed this little statement I'd make before I'd even open my mouth about the sky crane. It goes like this. Great works and great folly may be indistinguishable at the outset. I love statements like this because they are both true and meaningless. The truth of it is, of course, that if something's really, really new, you guys get this, it's going to look weird, right? People might not adopt it. They might even understand how to relate to it. They might even think it's crazy. The meaninglessness of this statement is, of course, that crazy also looks crazy. So just because you say this doesn't mean that the next words out of your mouth represent a great work. Although I'll tell you a little secret. You say those words to a room, and then no matter what comes out of your mouth, they're like, oh, maybe that's a great work. Now, unfortunately, the team also labored under this conundrum, this paradox. We didn't know whether what we had done was a great work or great folly. You know, we couldn't test our landing system. We live here on Earth. The Earth is the third rock from the sun, not the fourth. Bigger planet, more gravity, more atmosphere, different speed of sound, different temperature. We can't test our landing system. We can do analysis, and we did. Pen and paper analysis, computer simulation. This is an example of one of millions of computer simulations that we did. Here we're landing the rover on a slope so slippery that she cannot rove, and yet we can still land her. Computer simulations like this buoyed our confidence that maybe we were doing the right thing, that maybe what we were engaged with was not great folly, but perhaps great work. Now, unfortunately, you guys might be familiar with this, simulation, models and simulation, don't protect you against everything. In fact, they do not specifically protect you against sins of omission, the I forgots. I build a model of the universe in ones and zeros inside the computer. If I forget an important physical law, let's say the second law of thermodynamics, and that's important, which, by the way, I don't think that the second law of thermodynamics is important for this landing, and it's not in this model, but let's say I was wrong. All that the computer will do is just turn the crank on this universe that I've created in ones and zeros inside its bowels and pop out an answer for me. And I might like the answer, but it may be not related at all to what's going to happen at Mars. So that question, great work, great folly, hung large over the team. And really, we had only one way to prove it. It was a test, a $2.5 billion test, and it occurred on the 5th of August, 2012. We gathered thousands of people together who had worked on this for over a decade, and collectively we held our breaths to see if what we were doing was a great work or great folly.
Coming up on entry. Vehicle reports entry interface. At this time, it will begin pressurizing the propulsion system to increase the thrust of the system. We'll use that for all the maneuvering in the atmosphere we're about to do. The vehicle has just reported via tones that it has started guided entry. Target at this time. We have seen peak deceleration. We should have parachute deploy around Mach 1.7. Parachute is deployed. We are decelerating. Speed chill has separated. We're found the ground. We're down to 90 meters per second at an altitude of 6.5 kilometers and descending. Standing by for back shell separation. We are in powered flight. We're at an altitude of 1 kilometer and descending. Standing by for sky crane. Sky crane is started.
Signal to us, you remain strong.
Touchdown confirmed. We're safe on Mars. Time to see where our curiosity will take us.
That was a good night. Infinitely preferable to the night that might have awaited us if things had gone just a little bit differently. A lot of stuff had to go right for that to come together. Now, I know for myself, and I know for many of the members of our team, that the ones and zeros that come down, the numbers that tell you that the spacecraft done its job, they take the front of my brain to figure out. They don't have the rear brain, visceral connection to our work as these. These are the first images of a new place in our solar system brought to you by the, frankly, blood, sweat, and tears of over 3,000 women and men scattered over 37 states and 7 nations. They are, from the right to the left, the first image of Mount Sharp seen from the surface of Mars. This is taken the day after landing from a camera on the front of the rover. Its dust cover has been removed, so the image is quite clear. You can see the shadow of the rover. It looks a little bit like a transformer. And you can see Mount Sharp looming high in the background. And in the mid, you can see a beautiful black sand dune that separates us from Mount Sharp. In the middle here, the first color image of the surface of Gale Crater. This is taken by the Molly imager on the robotic arm. We have a robotic arm on the front of the rover, and in its hand, it holds a camera. This is taken a few days after landing, but we have not yet removed the clear plastic dust cover that covers the lens. And the red iron oxide-rich dust that gives Mars its red hue gives this image a particularly ghostly red color. But my favorite image on this slide, my favorite image from the mission, is in the far left. This is the very first image taken from the surface of Gale Crater. We had a science orbiter in orbit around Mars as we descended through the atmosphere. In fact, all the data, all the telemetry you saw us reacting to in the control room came through that communication link. We were just about to lose that link. We had time for maybe one image, maybe enough bandwidth to get an image down, and we chose this image. It's from the rear hazard cameras. These are fisheye lensed cameras on the back end of the rover. They're really there to protect us when we drive around so we don't bump into rocks. We took that image moments after touchdown because we were hoping, kind of against hope, like unbelievably, that we might see that. Now, I know that that is impressive to you as it is to me. That actually is the impact plume of the descent stage. So we separated from our jet backpack, which we call the descent stage. We lowered ourselves to the surface of Mars. And then once Mars had taken up the weight of the rover, we cut free and flew to the rear of the rover a safe distance and impacted the surface. We took that image just after the descent stage had impacted the surface, and that is the ejecta plume of the crater of that impact. So it was a really good night, right? We got things we kind of expected or hoped for, a successful landing, and we got things we never even dreamed we would really get, an action selfie of the landing. All the numbers, it was a good night. The green, the red, and the black are variously where we thought the rover would have landed when it touched down, where the rover thought it had landed, and where it actually did land. And they're separated by, a few hundred meters, which isn't good if you're playing golf. But if your golf shot is 352 million miles, that's pretty darn good. So how did it go so well? Of course, the answer sits here. An incredibly gifted team of individual contributors, yes, but perhaps even more importantly, an incredibly gifted team of collaborators. You know, my deputy and good friend Miguel San Martin and I really started to recognize how important this idea of team collaboration was for us to make breakthrough innovations, for us to really solve the tough challenges. And we ran into a story from history, the story of Enrico Fermi, one of the fathers of nuclear physics, and the first controlled fission reaction. As the story goes, Fermi is about to do the first controlled nuclear fission reaction in underneath the squash courts at the University of Chicago in a homemade fission reactor. By the way, I never want to be anywhere near a homemade fission reactor. That sounds like a bad idea. And as the story goes, a technician is removing some of the 3 control rods that are going to make this fission reaction sort of self-sustaining. And the technician removes the first rod, removes the second, and Fermi looks at his pocket watch. "Stop," he says. "It's lunchtime." They put the rods back, and they sit down at a big table and enjoy a moment of fellowship, a chance to commune with one another, talk about work or family or whatever. Make those connections, those human connections, the bonds of respect and love, really, that would allow them to work as vigorously, as intellectually vigorously as they needed. And then after a civilized lunch, they'd revolutionize our understanding of the universe forever. We so liked that idea, that story, that we put on everybody's calendar, an electronic calendar, it was Meeting Maker at the time, an invitation to a meeting called Lunch with Enrico between 12 and 1. It was there to protect that lunch hour from other people throwing in meetings during lunch, because everybody knows you're free during lunch hour, so let's schedule the meeting in the lunch hour. It was to protect it so that the team could get together, sometimes in 1s and 2s, down to the local cafeteria on lab, sometimes en masse down to Nicole's French Deli in South Pasadena with a couple of bottles of wine. Those moments together to build the bonds of trust and mutual respect allowed us to play very rough intellectually with one another and collaborate in a way that was extremely fruitful. I came to the conclusion that the strength or the quality of a product of a team is a direct reflection of the teamwork within that team. And I hope and I believe that our rover on Mars stands as a testament to our capacity to collaborate. So some specific lessons I want to help you with, specific observations. One, this idea of separating the ideas from the people who hold them. You love and respect the people, you get those bonds of trust, that creates a culture of collaboration. And by allowing the ideas to engage in unfettered, unprotected, mortal combat, you get a culture of innovation, where only the strongest ideas survive. Hold on to the doubt, which is a way of not selling your decision-making or solution-finding short. This is a weird set of words. When I was a student, I was a later student, right? I'd been playing rock and roll. I was returning late. The euphemism that I think colleges now use is a returning student. I was this returning student at the community college. I was a returning student at university and grad school, and I noticed one of the greatest ways that I made mistakes was by being scared about whether I knew the answer. You know, my college exams has a little paragraph at the top that says something like, a man leaves Chicago heading 500 miles due west, and some big word problem, and then you're supposed to answer in the vast openness of white space below, showing your work, answer that question. And that big blank space below would terrify me. I would sit at the threshold wondering, do I have it? Do I have it in me to answer this question? Will I get it right? And that anxiety would ball up, and I would just jump and start answering. And frequently I'd find that I'd answer the question wrong, or more commonly answer the wrong question, that I hadn't really spent time pondering it. Now at my university, they allowed you to take cheat sheets in, and so all of my friends would take a triple-aught rapidograph, and they'd write every single example problem down, and they'd come in with this sort of almost black-colored cheat sheet. And I, being some crazy hippie from Northern California, would take colored marker and write, hold on to the doubt on my sheet. Because all I really needed to do to get it as right as I could was not rush into the answer, but really sit contemplating the question for a few moments. And that's all fine and good for college, but I noted later in life, when I was working professionally, that people would do it. Teams would do it. Whole groups would be faced with an open question, and the group itself would be anxious enough that they would leap to the quickest answer they could. They wanted to know that they had an answer so badly that they would accept the first answer that they could get. When you do that, you sell yourself short. You sell your solution short. I have found that if you allow yourself to sit there with that open question, turn it over in your mind, really understand it, perhaps for all of its profoundness, profundity, that the solutions you get to, that the answers you come up with are far more capable, are far better than if you rush. If you roll the open question in your mind, your decision-making is curiosity-based. If you don't, if you leap, if you let anxiety dominate, you're really making what I call fear-based decision-making. And you might get away with it, but the product's not going to be as good as it could. Some particular practical tips. You can't get, a team cannot display behavior that the leader doesn't model. That's the first rule of parenting, by the way. You can't tell your kids to do something that that hypocrisy. Children recognize hypocrisy starting at about 8 months old. They're like, whatever, I can't even talk, and I know you're full of it. So you have to model that separation, and I would do that. I would bring up my own ideas, I would hold them out, and then I would beat the bejesus out of them. I would offer, taunt, challenge, welcome, bet beers on whether people could do a better job beating up the ideas. In fact, there were times when I would ask team members if they brought a new change, when we wanted to make a change to our landing system. Bring in that change. I totally want you to do that. And here's what I want you to do when you share it with the team. I want you to talk about the 3 virtues of your proposal, but much more importantly, I want you to tell us the 3 central deficits, the 3 warts, the 3 biggest warts. I would never criticize anybody about how well they characterize the virtues of their idea, but I would be a little vicious if they didn't seriously consider the deficits. That sort of forces us into sort of an objective separation between our ideas and ourselves. And that allows us to feel unthreatened when our ideas are challenged. And you always want your ideas to be challenged. You know, leadership is not a crown. It's not a throne. You're not there because you're the smartest guy in the room or the best guy in the room. Or if you are, I pity you because you haven't constructed a great team. You should be looking to build a team that is better than you. Somebody's got to lead. It's kind of a service function. Someone's got to do it. Your job is really there to facilitate, to maybe steer the efforts of a very capable team, and maybe upon occasion, when push comes to shove, to make hard decisions. But it's not because you're above everybody. And if you put yourself above everybody, you put a ceiling of where people can go. But if you don't, if you encourage them to be better and smarter than you, you don't limit where they can top out. And finally, a little hippie love. I'm a selfish man, or so my lovely wife tells me. And I want to have a good time when I'm working. I don't know if any of you have ever done this calculation. It's slightly disheartening to do what fraction of my waking life am I at work? It's a lot. And I want to have a good time at work. So I discovered a long time ago that I have a few choices. I can go to work and work with this group of people, and I can look for stuff to dislike within my team members. Like, God, the way that guy clicks his teeth when he's just thinking, or why is he always putting his feet up on the desk? What is up with that? Or I could look for something to love in everybody. Look for something to appreciate, something to connect with, something to enjoy. So I choose that. I choose that not because it's a management technique. I choose it not because the world's a better place. By the way, both those are true. I choose it for selfish purposes. I choose it so that I'll have a better time. That means it's authentic. I'm really there. I'm really loving those people because that's what I want to do and it feels good to me. Now, as a side effect, they notice. They respond. They like it. They try it back on me and they try it on each other. And pretty soon, the whole team is having this gargantuan love fest. We were doing something that many people think is one of the hardest aerospace challenges of this decade, certainly, and we were having a blast. 10 years of a blast doing the hardest job that anybody could think of. Mostly because we were really enjoying each other while we did it. Now, NASA is not all hugs and kisses and butterflies and rainbows. No pony, no Rainbow Bright or Dash. And so 30 days after we landed, we took this panorama. This is a mosaic underneath the rover to make sure that we had not landed her on a rock. If we had landed on a rock, I probably would not be here speaking to you today. And then NASA patted us on the back and said, thank you very much, landing team. Go find more work because you're fired. You're out. Here's your pink slip. And they brought a whole new crew of people in because it ends up being that the mission was not all about the landing. It's actually about the roving of the rover. We were really just the movers. We just got it there, and we got back in the truck and drove off. So the team, the science team of 400 and a very gifted group of rover drivers and surface engineers showed up. They took a look at the goal. Let me blow that up. These layered terrain that you see there on the foothills of Mount Sharp, that's why we came to the Gale Crater. We had seen from orbit signatures of clay minerals. We know that clays are formed in water here on Earth. We wanted to go interrogate those minerals to see if it could give us signs of the ancient wet environment on Mars. Those minerals are found, this is an aerial picture of our landing. We named it Bradbury Landing. Ray Bradbury passed a few days after we landed. And those clay minerals in the foothills of Mount Sharp would be seen straight down, due south in this image. So our plan was to go there. But what did the scientists decide to do? As soon as we got to the surface of Mars, they decided to go 90 degrees to the plan, orthogonal to the plan. I love that. That brings up the great classic Dwight D. Eisenhower quote, which is, "Planning is everything, the plan is nothing." The plan is a model of the future universe you think you're going to run into and how you will respond to it. The plan is this idea you have of what you'll find in the future. If you're a reasonably minded person, it's easy to agree that the only thing we know about the plan is that it is absolutely not the actual universe we'll run into. But sometimes we put so much energy into creating that plan that we don't want to let go of it. And even though the universe is telling us it's not that place that we thought we were going to be in the plan, we sort of exist in this cognizant dissonance and try very hard to imagine that the world is that world we thought it would be. Thank God the scientists didn't do this. They got on the ground, they said, "Oh, that's cool down there. I understand we picked, out of all the places on Mars, we picked to come here because of that place straight down south. But right now we like this place, Yellowknife Bay, more." And I'm very happy they did, because it was a 2-year mission, 2-year prime mission. And within the first 6 months over at Yellowknife Bay, we deployed our arm, drilled with our powdering drill into the surface of Mars, taken this gray-blue material, which does not look like that highly oxidized red color. That powder, we'd distribute it to science instruments in the belly of the rover and come back with the data that gave the scientists the answer Curiosity had been sent to look for. The answer is yes. The ancient aqueous environment of Mars was habitable for life. Was Mars alive back then? That question stays out in front of us. But 3.5 billion years ago, when Earth life was first forming, the environment on Mars was conducive to life. Did life start on Earth and get ejected from asteroid impact onto Mars? Did life start on Mars and get ejected by asteroid impact onto Earth and we're all Martians? That'd be weird. Could happen. Those questions hang in our future. But we do know that back when life was starting on Earth, Mars was conducive to life. So here she is, Curiosity. 2,000 pounds of American ingenuity, according to the president's science advisor, Stephen Holdren. And she's on Mars doing our Curiosity's bidding. But this image gives me a question. Why did I do that? Why did I spend 10 years of my life building a robot to root around on the dirt on another planet? Is that a particularly practical thing to do? Sometimes when I think about human behavior and practicality, I get a little confused. But some things I know to be practical, like this is practical. Not the selfie, but the 737-700 in the background. I'm at Burbank Bob Hope Airport. I'm going to get on that plane. It's going to take me down to Houston Hobby Airport, outside the gates of the Johnson Space Center. I make that trip a few times a year, actually several times a year. It takes 3 hours and 15 minutes for me to make that trip. When my mother was my age, that trip would have taken 3 days. When her mother was my age, it would have taken 3 weeks. Air travel has revolutionized the way we think about our world, the way we move goods and services, the way we do business. And yet, if you look at the early exploration of flight, the foreshadowing of the practical importance is not obvious. Early exploration of flight looks a little bit ridiculous, actually. It looks like it could possibly be injurious. Early explorers probably should have been a little embarrassed. Maybe some of them should have been downright humiliated. I don't know what this guy was thinking. And unfortunately, all too frequently, early explorers paid with the greatest of prices. And yet, we kept at it. We kept doing it. Despite it being injurious, despite it being impractical, we kept at it, and we eventually tamed the skies, even though for years, air travel would be a risky proposition. So we do not explore because it is practical. In fact, we explore despite it being impractical. Do we do it for the science? Do we do it for the pure science of it? Here's an image of Times Square on Monday morning, the 6th of August at 1:30 a.m. We landed at 10:30 at night Pacific, 1:30 a.m. Eastern. Times Square's chock-a-block full with people. I'm told it was a lightning storm, and they're there to watch the landing on the big jumbo screen. Now, are they there because they are just so dying to know about the pH and salinity of the ancient aqueous environment on the surface of Mars that they just gotta get it? No, I don't think so. I think it's a lot more like when tens of thousands of people come together to watch to see if an athlete can cross a set distance at a fraction of a second faster than another athlete. I think when we're exploring, we're asking questions about ourselves. As individuals, as groups, as teams, as a nation, as people, we're searching for the edge of us. What can we do? I think Neil Armstrong understood that when he chose the words he'd say when he'd first stepped foot on the moon. One small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. He was hinting that he was carrying us with him, that his exploration was our exploration, and that as he became more by that tiny footprint juxtaposed against the vast emptiness of space, we all became a little bit more. When we explore, we're really asking questions of humanity. Who are we? How grand are we? How great is our reach? What questions might we dare ask and believe we can get the answers? So I've been thinking a bit about exploration and curiosity and the power of it since landing. Mostly since landing. I had a great job. I was doing this job. We landed. People kind of freaked out. I was moved by how many people so far from the project responded to us landing that I started to recognize we were doing something that was sort of a fundamental gesture of our humanity. You know, we are the curious apes. We are weirdos, okay? Born through hips too narrow to pass a fully baked human brain, we come into this world naked and incapable, almost completely unprogrammed. We don't have instincts. We don't know where to go in the winter. We don't move south. We don't build nests. We don't come in knowing how to do almost anything. We come in almost completely unprogrammed, save for a few instructions, perhaps the most paramount of which is be curious. Every single one of you in this room, before you could talk, built a fairly accurate model of the universe through your curiosity. You touched and tasted things. You poured sand and water and put your hands and feet in things. You experimented and explored, and through that process, wordlessly, you constructed a model of the universe that differentiated between solids and liquids, that understood gravity and time and mass. You even understood Newton's second law, even though you hadn't been able to articulate it or decompose it in your mind. All of us have that curiosity in it. Now, something strange happens. As we get older, we use that curiosity a little bit less and less. We get a reliable model of the universe, and we just go back to that model. But again, that model is doomed to be outdated, or large pieces of it, If you're in the tech world, that model has a very short shelf life. Its freshness date is not very long. So you've got to stay curious. A curious mind stays agile, innovative, and competitive. You can make a culture within a team that puts a premium on that curiosity. And if you can keep that culture, a curious mind and a culture of collaboration inside your team, really, there's not much that a group of human beings cannot do. If the laws of physics allow it, you can do it. So, what is next for NASA? Well, our scientists tell us that to really unlock the mysteries that Mars has, we have to bring a piece of Mars back to Earth. The effort is called Mars Sample Return. It's a lot of work. It takes 3 missions, a mission to grab the samples and seal them, a mission to take the sealed samples and put them on orbit around Mars, and another mission to scoop them up from orbit and bring them back to Earth. But we're working on that first mission, something that could be that first mission, called Mars 2020. I'm the chief engineer, and I look forward to putting some sealed samples on the surface of Mars to be returned for a later date. But Mars is not the only place to explore. Europa, the ice moon of Jupiter, an ice crust that a kilometer, 2, 10, 40 kilometers thick. We don't know the thickness of the ice, but we do know that underneath that ice there's a liquid water ocean more than twice the volume of all the seas on Earth. Now, I'm not an exobiologist, but I drink beer with exobiologists. And they tell me that Europa is their #1 bet for a place to find life existing today in our solar system. I hope to put a lander on the surface of that ice and see what signs of life have bubbled up from below. So now, when I look at this image, it doesn't wake me up at night. My 6-month-old son, Ansel, wakes me up at night at 2:30 in the morning. Now I look at this and I'm mostly humbled by the fact that I was able to participate in a project that was kind of a gesture of our collective humanity, that gets to change the history books, change the science books. But this image also gives me a question. It opens a question for me. It's a good question. It asks me, what's next for me? A decade or so ago, when I followed my curiosity, when I let it take me astray, some pretty incredible things happened. My curiosity, all of our curiosities, can really be the key to unlocking new solutions, change, and sort of creating a new future. So it's an interesting question to ask, for each of you to ask yourselves. Perhaps it's best asked and not answered, left hanging open, the doubt held onto, rotating it again and again in your minds. Where will your curiosity next take you? Thank you very much for your attention. We've got some time for questions if you'd like to ask a couple questions. You can raise your hands, you can walk to the mics, either way, or neither way. Don't be bashful, it's okay. Going once? Yes?
It's kind of silly. Does curiosity actually sing Happy Birthday to itself?
Yeah. It can't really do a good job of singing Happy Birthday to itself because there's not a lot of atmosphere on the surface of Mars. It sounds very wheezy. No, we do all sorts of things with the vehicle. The folks who operate the vehicle get license. Every day they get to pick a wake-up song for the day's efforts. We got to pick a wake-up song for landing. We chose Frank Sinatra, All or Nothing at All. And it sings itself happy birthday, but really all we do is we put happy birthday in a transmission, and then it transmits back to us happy birthday. Other questions?
Hey, so one thing I was wondering about, when you guys sort of launch this thing, you have a fair bit of time between launch and the actual landing.
Yes.
I'm curious about the work that goes on there, or if you found like, oh, somebody forgot like a zero in some program, and we need to like shift that and
Right.
you know, make last minute changes. How do you do that
Right.
in the middle of space in production?
Yes, so we're, perhaps like you guys, we're constantly working on the thing, on our product, all the way up to the release date, and past the release date, we're working on updates. For us, the thing that happens when you launch it, you can no longer change the hardware. That's done. It's really hard to reach the hardware. So, but we can continue to work the software, and we did. We do a lot of testing, right? We really worried, especially during entry, descent, and landing, that a software gork, a fault that would precipitate a fault response or reset could be the end of the mission. And so we exercised that software for years before we landed, and including the 9 months that we were in cruise, we were constantly checking the software. And in fact, 3 days before landing, we discovered an error in a parameter set. Worse, an error in a parameter set that wasn't. We built our parameters in 3 families. Stuff we're never going to touch, deep bowels of the earth parameters. Stuff that if things go poorly, we might have to touch. And things that we plan to touch and retouch, like targeting. The targeting of the rover's entry was sort of a function of the Martian weather. And so we were getting weathered updates every morning as we approached. And so targeting parameters were in a set of files that we regularly exercised the process of touching. Naturally, the error we found was in the bowels of the beast. And so we really sweated bullets, you know. We couldn't find proof that that error would have caused us to fail. But I feared that the models that we knew that the models that we had of the spacecraft were really low fidelity models. They didn't resolve a lot of the behaviors or functions of the spacecraft. And so we argued to make the change, even though we didn't have proof we needed to, and even though it was in the bowels of the beast, and we did, and we survived, and yay. Yes?
A lot of cultures encourage people to defend their ideas, and you talked about separating the ideas from the people, and you talked about modeling it yourself. But I'm curious what else you do to sort of bring someone in and sort of get them in this culture of actually letting go of their ideas and
great question. Did you hear the question? You know, many cultures encourage people to defend their ideas. And so what does this team culture look like where you offer your ideas up for sacrifice, as it were? We tried, we tried. The lab has this culture that's relatively flat. I accentuate that. I am, in general, irreverent to all things, and myself. And so I model, in that process, models, you know, people walk in and they're like, oh my God, you're calling Adam Steltzner a dumbass. How can you do that? Because those silly people think, I don't know what they think, but I can be a dumbass. And so we strived for a culture that was very flat, where not very hierarchical, where we encouraged people to move outside their domains of expertise. You know, sometimes the beginner's mind, the eyeballs of new insight, can help an expert recognize something that they've lost track of. You know, sometimes people in a field, a domain of expertise, will lose track of finding the forest for the trees, and they'll be in the trees, and somebody who's outside their field can go, whoa, but those trees are in the wrong valley. And they go, oh, wow. And so I encouraged the propulsion people to talk to the electronics people and the flight software people to talk about hardware. That all of that interchange was fair game. And that sort of breaks down the barriers and makes people more comfortable putting their opinions forward. Yes?
I'm just curious what the timeline was like for you to go from a wannabe rock star to a chief engineer at NASA.
1985, start community college. Start working at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in 1991. So 6 years there was kind of intense, 6 years. Like did high school over again and then undergraduate and then a master's. Then worked at the lab for a couple of years. I'd met the woman who would become my ex-wife. And we decided to go back to graduate school together and finished our PhDs. And then, so I've been at the lab since 91. In fact, it's still September, but next month, in 2 weeks, it'll be my 25th anniversary at JPL. And so that was kind of the timeline. It's a lot of work. There was some work involved. People, when I say this, when I first talked about that story, I don't talk about all of the stuff that happened. And I was giving this talk at Google, and lots of young kids, these kids nowadays, lots of folks who grew up watching like Zuckerberg make billions of dollars in 2 seconds have this expectation of, oh yeah, that's what you do. You work for 3 years and then you're on top of the world. You work for 10 years and you're on top of the world. And so a whole bunch of people after the Google talk came out and said, oh yeah, so that's totally cool that NASA just like hires people who were like, just playing rock and roll and then decided to learn a little bit about the stars and then they hired you to be chief engineer. I'm like, oh, no, actually there was about 8 or 9 years of incredibly hard work at several academic institutions between rock and roll and PhD. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, it definitely did.
Okay.
I was also kind of wondering where you started at NASA, because it obviously wasn't a chief engineer, right?
No. I started as red shirt. I started as engineer 1. Something's happening. Go figure that out. I started as, junior, whatever it was called, member of the technical staff is how I started, which is actually not the bottom. There's an associate member of the technical staff. Those really do get to wear the red shirts. And it's just because I had a master's degree when I started. So I went through my master's and then applied to the lab because I'd met this woman who was also at Caltech in grad school, and I wanted to stay there and marry her, eventually to divorce her. And so I went and worked at the lab, and I started in as member of technical staff. And naturally, in the intervening 25 years, they've changed all the names of all the little spots. So now there's like 6 or 8 levels that you may make your way through. Yes, sir.
Yes, I was wondering, you mentioned that you kept the team together for 10 years. I was kind of curious, did you have any turnover, or how did you approach getting people up to speed with the culture that you were building, this whole idea of separation of ideas?
So we did have some turnover, but not much. Some of it's cheating. We are aerospace engineers building a massive rover to go to Mars. It doesn't really get any better than that, right? Where are you going to go? What are you going to do? But I think that this flat culture, this empowered culture, where all of the team members are valued, where we understand that good ideas can come from anybody, doesn't have to come from the major domo, it can come from the floor sweeper. That sense of empowerment gives each team member skin in the game. And I didn't want the team members to be motivated. I wanted them to be on fire. I needed them to be on fire. And so I'm on fire, you're on fire, we're having a blast, we're loving each other, we're empowering one another, and we got this really, really hard job to do. We made it like an awesome, fun game-ish thing, and it seemed to work. I'm going to take, because that guy's standing behind you, you are the last question. No, they're right, you. You're it, man. Make it good.
You mentioned fixing software issues in flight.
Yes.
What software side issues, if any, would cause you to abort the launch and go to the next launch window?
Great question. So our launch opportunities happen every 26 months. It's hard, it's expensive to slip. In fact, we did slip. We were scheduled for a 2009 launch, and we slipped to 2011, and we slipped because we weren't ready in many dimensions. That slip cost $600 million. So there is no software bug that would cause us to slip the launch. We would, because we can fix it in flight, unless there was some error. I mean, really, it would be a hardware error that would take us to not launch. You know, it's a little bit like a product debut, right? A product release date, except you can kind of slip the product release date. If things really don't go well, you can go like, it's going to be in September, not August. But for us, celestial mechanics are kind of wicked. And there's actually a moment each day, depending on the rocket we use, there's an instant, 1 second, a moment, click each day where you can launch. And if you don't make it that day, make it the next day. And there's only like 21 days in a 2-year cycle where those moments happen. And so you have to get the job done by the time, or it costs a lot of money and you get in big, big trouble. All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention.